Committee of the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask that members of this committee respond to a roll call to identify their presence at this meeting that's being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic medium. Jim Kilmartin.
Present.
Chris Haben.
Here.
Betsy Henderson.
Present.
Marcy Lichtenberg. She was not on today, is that right?
I believe she's going to be joining us late.
Okay. And Heidi Bella.
Here.
I note that the following BSRB staff members are also present. David Fye.
Here.
Leslie Allen.
Here.
Next, David Fye will read a message regarding this meeting being held remotely.
Thank you, Mary. This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. Time has been reserved today for a presentation by Dr. Ben Caldwell on the topic of artificial intelligence. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is being conducted by medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of KOMA are not suspended, so we will be conducting this meeting pursuant to the KOMA. On August 22nd, 2024, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who have requested notice of such meeting. The notice was also posted on the board's website at ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other media material have been posted on the board's website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda specifically by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and the YouTube channel that allows members of the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if there are any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240 or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of this meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And the conference call line is active. There was no one on the conference call line when we got started, but if I hear someone beep over, I will let you know.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Our first item of business today is agenda approval. You received the agenda in your packet of materials. If there aren't any other changes, I would accept a motion to approve.
So moved.
Well, thank you, Jim. We'll take Betsy as that second on there. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Same sign. Okay, thank you very much. As Dave mentioned, we do have a guest today. So Dr. Caldwell, I'm going to hand this over to you for presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, members of the committee. Thank you, David. I really appreciated the invite to come and speak with you all this morning. I'm a California licensed MFT, but I grew up in a little brick house on Massachusetts Street in Lawrence. So it's an honor and a pleasure to be talking with you this morning. I am here to talk about artificial intelligence. I've got a couple of slides that I'll kind of go through along the way. But really my intent here is to facilitate a conversation and to answer questions as best I can. I've done some...
My apologies to interrupt you. If you'd like, you can share your screen. That way it would make the presentation a little bit larger. If you'd like to share your slides.
Well, here's the thing. I've got a production switcher in here. What if I do this instead? What if I can I pin? Does that only impact me, or does that make the slides bigger for you too?
Right now we can just see the video of yourself in your background.
Does that make the slides bigger or no?
It just shows it on your screen, but I can try to make an adjustment here and just show your screen. So.
If you're the host and you can do what Zoom calls spotlight on me, that should make it sort of bigger for everybody.
Okay. I've just done a speaker view, so I think that should take care of it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So I'll go back and forth. Since COVID, I've got nicer studio stuff than I really have any right to here in my office. So I've done a lot of online training stuff. That's why instead of a screen share, it's got this other thing. But I'll do some going back and forth. I'm also more than happy to send you this slide deck so that you can distribute it to the committee after our meeting today. As I said, there's not a ton here. It's just more points to facilitate conversation. To give you a little bit of background on me, like I said, I'm a California licensed MFT. I teach for Cal State Northridge. I've been working in ethics and policy and technology stuff for a long time. Chris, I'm a fan of yours. Really known your work for a long time. And a few years ago, I chaired the committee for AAMFT that did the best practices in the online practice of couple and family therapy. And that's kind of what got me interested in this road of technology and policy. But I do think it's important to emphasize in these discussions that I come to this not as a proponent of AI and not as an opponent of AI. I more take the perspective of I am interested in where the technology is right now, where it's going to take us as a field. But I think one of the challenges when you're trying to gather information about AI and mental health care is that so much of the information that's out there either suggests that this is going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread, or that it is going to tear the profession apart. And I just don't think that either one of those things is true. I do think that we're going to see rapidly growing influence from AI. But I come to this again, not as an advocate in one direction or another, but really more with the intention of trying to inform. From that place, I want to talk a little bit about the difference between computing and AI, because in the discussions I've had with other clinicians about this, other policymakers, one of the questions that comes up is, isn't this just sort of really fancy, powerful computing? Isn't this just the next iteration of some of the same technology stuff we've been doing for a long time? And I think the short answer to that is no. This really is a qualitatively different evolution of technology. And for those of you who have either through yourself or family members, folks who are in the tech world, what I'm going to offer here is a bit oversimplified. Please rest assured that I know that. And folks with more technical expertise might quibble with this correctly. But this is the best sort of metaphor that I have found to understand and explain the difference. With sort of traditional computing, we take a data set and apply specific defined rules to that data set to come up with predictable outcomes. This is as simple as on a spreadsheet putting in a formula that will take data from some cells and give you answers in other cells. Those rules are specified by programmers. They're applied consistently. They should produce really reliable outcomes. And it also can be a little bit tedious. It can be really complicated and can be inefficient. That's part of the sort of the driving motivation behind AI is that AI might be able to find creative solutions to a wide variety of problems that human programmers would really struggle with. In AI, what we're doing, and again, this is sort of shorthand, think of this as a metaphor, we're taking those last two steps and sort of flipping them. The process of training AI means giving an AI engine a whole lot of data, the outcomes that resulted from that data, and basically telling the AI, you determine the rules. You figure out what the most efficient path is from point A to point B. You do the data analysis part. And then as we kind of feed in more data going forward, those rules that you decide are the best way to get from point A to point B can change, can adapt to new data in ways that typical computing does not. Now, that doesn't mean that all AI is going to be sort of wildly off the rails. And another challenge as we talk about this is that not all AI is created equal. Some systems actually have very significant guardrails built in, others less so. In the world of mental health care, we're using AI differently in different places among different practitioners. One example would be the AI systems available right now today that you could go purchase off the shelf that would produce a first draft of a progress note for you. Another example of a use in mental health care would be actually AI providing the therapy through a chatbot or through a video avatar. That also exists right now today. And I'll come back to that a little bit later on. But because we're talking about different uses, the different uses bring forth some different regulatory concerns. If we focus just on documentation as an example, there are different processes that different companies use. There are, last I checked, more than a dozen different providers already offering AI-based documentation to mental health professionals. And if you dig into the details of those different companies, some of them, in order to generate a first draft of a progress note, make a recording of the session. And then they process the recording to develop the first draft of the progress note. Obviously, when you're recording sessions, that is a meaningful level of privacy concern. How long is the recording going to be retained? Are we getting client permission for that? What happens with the data? And so forth. Some of the other companies that are doing AI-based documentation, they don't make a recording of the session. They give the therapist a handful of prompts to answer, and then based on the responses to those prompts, they generate a draft of a progress note. And still other companies will do that kind of prompt-based process, but they will tell the mental health professional, we don't want any PHI. Don't give us any private information about the clients. Tell us a little bit about what is happening in the therapy, like how you do therapy. We will give you the draft of a progress note that then you put the PHI into for loading into whatever your electronic health record system is. So even in the world of documentation, we're talking about different kinds of processes, different levels of risk associated with that process or with those processes. So it's really hard to talk about AI as if it was a monolith. It's not just one thing. And even within the same kind of use, documentation in this case, you can find different professionals taking on different levels of risk in how they are applying AI in their practices. Different places have different privacy safeguards built in. As it relates to AI actually being a therapy provider, there are some companies that are going through the process of getting their AI chatbot through the FDA as a medical device, whereas other companies are working just outside of the regulatory framework, calling the service that they offer mental health support or mental health coaching, being really careful not to call it therapy, not to use the language of therapy, so as to kind of sidestep some of the regulatory burdens that might otherwise come with trying to get registered as a medical device, trying to say that you're making a meaningful medical intervention. Certainly different intentions. The companies may have wildly different plans for what they're going to do with all of this data. Are they simply trying to become the best AI documentation provider that they can become, or are they ultimately looking to monetize the data that comes in different ways? Considering all of these differences between AI uses, for both professionals and regulators, we have to do some kind of nuanced analysis. Are we able to craft policies and practices that appropriately handle the full range of potential AI applications? Narrowing in here a little bit on documentation, as I said, more than a dozen companies offer this right now today, where they will draft the first draft of a progress note. You as a professional still read through the note. You're still responsible for its quality. You make any changes that you might need to make, and then you sign the note, put it into your EHR, etc. What's nice about these systems, their big selling points, are that they save time and that they might make documentation stronger. One example would be if you take 5 minutes on a progress note and AI can knock that down to 2. Well, 3 minutes for one progress note doesn't sound like very much, but if you consider that over the full course of a year, maybe somebody's doing 1,000 sessions. If they can get 3,000 minutes back as a result of using AI-based documentation, that's more than a full work week that they are getting back. That's 50 hours of time that they are getting back as a result of using AI. So the sort of time element of it, that's going to be a real appeal to a lot of folks in private practice. Interestingly, the stronger documentation is the appeal to agencies and hospitals and other larger systems. I was talking with an employer in Northern California not too long ago, and they are planning on transitioning, they're actually in the process already, of transitioning their entire system to AI-based documentation. And this is across hundreds and hundreds of clinicians. I was talking with their clinical director and I said, well, I'm curious about this because this does seem to be the direction a lot of places are headed. Can you give me your rationale? And she said, the time part is nice, but what we really were looking at was the difficulty in getting all of our clinicians to do their documentation in a timely manner that is good enough to stand up to an audit. And what we saw in our testing of these AI systems was that, of course, the documentation is timely, but it also is much more consistent and much more in line with the requirements of all of our funding sources. So what we feel like we would be spending on this AI-based documentation system is going to be less than what we ultimately are saving ourselves in terms of clawbacks. It was just a financial decision. And of course, they have to go through all the stuff of making sure that they've got the right policies and protections in place. But to them, it was simple dollars and cents. And it made more sense to go with AI-based documentation instead of continually trying to train and retrain their providers on sort of human-based documentation, knowing that it was still going to be inconsistent. They were still going to have struggles with documentation adequacy. On the con side, again, some of these systems require session recordings. There are questions of bias in AI and data handling. What happens with that data after the first draft of the progress note is made? Is it the kind of thing where that is sort of the extent of the data that the AI system is going to handle? Or are they continually using the changes that providers make to their notes to strengthen the AI going forward? Different companies have different policies and practices about this. If you look at our existing legal and ethical obligations, of course, under HIPAA, if an app uses any protected health information, we have to get a business associate agreement from that outside company, from that AI provider that is going to be utilizing or storing PHI on our behalf. We also need to get permission from the clients for any kind of session recording, even if, as some of those AI documentation providers do, the recording is going to be deleted within a matter of hours after the session is over. The ethics codes don't tend to talk about the timeline. They just say if there's going to be a recording of the session, that recording needs to come with specific permission from the clients, like with third-party observation. In terms of the other uses that are available, right now, today, AI can assist with diagnostic screening, can help people kind of figure out the most likely diagnosis for a client. AI can help deliver some CBT exercises. And this is one of those uses where AI is sort of quasi-therapy, but it's staying just outside of the regulatory framework. They're saying that they can help administer some CBT-based exercises to clients. Similarly, there's some cognitive restructuring apps that are out there, medication reminders, that kind of thing, mindfulness and meditation stuff. All of these things tend to not advertise themselves specifically as mental health care, but there are therapists that are using these kinds of AI apps as kind of an adjunct to care, which starts to beg some of its own questions about, is that a proper utilization? Are the clinicians being cautious enough about the commercialization of client data? And then the most controversial one is AI-based therapy or mental health support. And again, these are things that exist right now today. You can go out and do a session of AI-based therapy if you want to. As it relates to our ethical responsibilities, there are so far no major associations that have adopted ethical standards specific to AI. I know that the different associations are looking at this. The American Counseling Association has been in the process of revising its ethics code for some time. There are rumors that the new edition of their code will come out either late this year or sometime next year. I would imagine that AI will be a part of that. There's an organization called the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists. That organization is independent of AAMFT, But CAMFT is also in the process of revising its ethics code, and they are looking specifically at AI as part of that. What seems likely at this point is that when various associations update their codes, they are going to emphasize transparency, essentially disclosure and consent, because those are the things that they feel like are most readily enforceable, most impactful, and there is concern that it might be unrealistic or unworkable to force providers to get into the weeds of these various apps' privacy policies and their data protection practices. We aren't expected as clinicians to be lawyers, but there is certainly a lot of complexity to be had there. What we have right now under the existing codes are efforts to apply the broader technology standards to specific AI applications. So if you're using an AI application as part of your practice, are you appropriately trained in that technology? Is there privacy protection in place for the clients? Is there informed consent? Is there permission for recording? Those things are existing ethical obligations that I think some clinicians really do a wonderful job with around their utilization of AI. And I think others wrestle with, not out of ill will or intentional malfeasance, but more like a focus on the convenience of AI-based documentation. And in some instances, I've talked with clinicians who don't even sort of put together, oh, right, the AI, in order to generate this note, is actually recording the session. Therefore, I need to get client permission for it. Some clinicians, I think, assume that because this is all done algorithmically, there's nobody in an office somewhere like physically observing the sessions, that therefore maybe they don't need as much client permission to make that happen. And the ethics codes just don't make that kind of a distinction. Conversational AI is what we tend to see the most of in movies and media depictions, that kind of thing. This is the closest to therapy as we tend to understand it, software that simulates conversations through natural language processing. Could be through a chatbot or an avatar, and the consumer interacts with it in real-time conversation. An avatar is kind of the video approach to it. I do a lot of teaching and training stuff. And so, as you can imagine, I get a lot of advertising for teaching and training related services. There are companies right now today that I could go make an appointment with if I wanted to. I can go into their office for a day, and they will do a whole lot of like 3D modeling of my face. They will do motion capture. They'll do kind of video capture. They'll do voice capture to not only get my tone of voice, but also my intonation, my cadence, how I raise and lower my voice at different moments. They can run all of that through an AI engine to come up with a relatively convincing video version of me. And these applications right now tend to be focused in the teaching and training world, but it's not a big jump from that over to conversational AI. What I could do right now in teaching and training, once they've made that avatar, I can type up a script and have this video version of me that looks like me, sounds like me, has pauses in its speech like me. I can have that version of me deliver the script. Doesn't take that much technology-wise to connect that with like ChatGPT so that someone could be doing a therapy session with a video version of me. Right now, we're in kind of the Tom Hanks in Polar Express stage of that AI. If you're familiar with that movie, it's well known as being representative of the sort of uncanny valley where animated characters using motion capture looked kind of wooden and close enough to be human to be creepy, but not close enough to be mistaken for an actual person. And I think for a lot of clinicians, we comfort ourselves with that knowledge that, okay, well, you can still tell that it's AI. It's not in a position yet to displace human therapists in a way that is going to fool a client. But it's a pretty short walk, historically speaking, from that Tom Hanks in Polar Express stage of movies to the very realistic de-aging of Indiana Jones. So it's not going to be a long time before those video avatar therapists are able to do therapy in a way that's actually a pretty close facsimile of how you or I might do therapy. It's not going to be the same. And I'm a very strong believer that there is something in the human interaction that technology just cannot take the place of. But I do think that for a lot of clients, it's going to be close enough. A lot of clients in surveys have expressed willingness and even preference to work with AI-based therapists because they don't have the same embarrassment, they don't have the same shame that they might experience talking with a human therapist. So, as I mentioned, AI-based therapy, it's already happening. I talked about the different kind of regulatory paths that companies are taking. Wobot Health is an example of a company that's going through the FDA process. Wysa is a different app, WYSA, that is kind of an example of one on that non-regulatory path. They're advertising their services as mental health support or coaching. But in both of those instances, those apps have already done millions of sessions of therapy. So this actually isn't even brand new at this point. It's a developing technology to be sure, but it's not like early stages of testing. These are very, very sophisticated models that have done a great deal of therapy already, some of it in the US, a lot of it outside of the US. In terms of your regulatory considerations, I do not profess to come in here and make specific recommendations about what you ought to do as a board, but I do want to talk about some of the things that I know regulatory boards are wrestling with. One is the question of jurisdiction, because as a board, you regulate the human providers, not the technology systems. So you have the ability to put requirements in place for what human therapists do using these systems, but it's much harder to actually regulate the systems themselves. What kinds of disclosures do therapists need to make to clients when they are using AI? Do they simply need to say, I am using AI as part of the therapeutic process? Do they need to disclose what those specific uses are? Do they need to disclose the specific companies so that clients, if they so choose, could go look at the data policies of those companies? On the therapist end, again, as a regulatory consideration, do therapists need to be aware of the data privacy practices and policies of the AI systems that they are using? Again, we're not lawyers, but should we be expected to have at least some understanding of whether client data is safe with these third-party companies? Similarly, how is that data ultimately going to be used? If a session recording gets deleted right away, then maybe I don't worry as much about the AI company hanging on to that as part of doing my documentation. But some companies will explicitly say, if you as the clinician are making changes in that first draft of the progress note, the AI company is going to retain a record of those changes because it helps their systems to get better going forward. You know, if a whole bunch of therapists are making the same kind of change, well, then maybe that kind of change should just be implemented automatically. And then as it relates to AI-based therapy specifically, there are questions about title and practice protection. Can an AI company call the service that they are providing therapy? Can they use terminology suggesting assessment, diagnosis, and treatment? Or does your state's title and practice protection set of laws protect against that? Make it so that a technology company isn't performing or calling the service they are doing therapy. They're not advertising the ability to treat a mental illness. I know that the American Psychological Association specifically defines therapy as a service provided by a trained professional. So APA would say that sort of definitionally, if a technology platform is providing the service, it isn't therapy. But states are kind of all over the map in terms of how their title and practice protection laws might address those kinds of questions. Speaking of questions, I am more than happy to take whatever questions you might have. I do have some articles on the topic if you wanted to read further about this on psychotherapynotes.com. A whole bunch of other stuff, including an interview that I just did on that Authory site. And then if you have questions for me directly, I'm more than happy to follow up as things emerge and as your process moves forward. But for right now, are there particular questions that I can help answer for you?
Well, Dr. Caldwell, I really appreciate you providing this information to the members of the advisory committee. We have 7 different professions that all have a mental health connection that are regulated by the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board in Kansas. And you mentioned in terms of from a regulatory body's perspective, how we might begin to kind of approach this topic. I'm curious, are you aware of any states that may be taking the first step in terms of putting something forward in terms of good rules or policies concerning the use of artificial intelligence?
I am aware of several states that are in what I would call a similar stage to where you are, that are in sort of the discussion stage, and depending on the state, the concern stage potentially. I don't know of any state so far that either has or is on the cusp of putting out really clear, useful guidelines or regulations specific to artificial intelligence. I think that is the path that at least some states want to be on. But I also think that a lot of states feel a little bit hamstrung by the fact that the professional associations, through their ethics codes, haven't put out a lot yet. I think it'll help push the process forward when we see clearer ethical standards from CAMFT, from the American Counseling Association. AAMFT has sort of gone, and I'm outside of this process, but as I understand it, AAMFT has sort of gone back and forth in terms of what it's doing with its ethics code right now. So I'm not sure where they are in their process. But I think once there is a set of ethical guidelines that's out there from any of these professions, that's going to help move the conversation forward.
Can I ask about specific concerns for MFTs? So working with multiple clients in the room rather than just one client in the room, and is that even being considered by these AI companies, and how that could impact specifically MFTs?
Yeah, I think the short answer is that it is being considered by the AI companies. It is a challenge right now for AI. So if you look at the documentation providers, only 1 or 2 of them that I am aware of even advertises that they can do AI-based progress notes for couple or family therapy. Most of them really focus on individual-based therapy. And when you get into talking about multiple people in the room, AI sometimes does really well with and sometimes struggles with parsing out different voices and who is saying what, and then kind of building a conceptual framework of what has happened in the session when there is more than a therapist and a client that's involved. I think that is on their radar for future development, but I think it's going to take them a little bit longer.
Yeah, I also am thinking of I work with young kids sometimes, like a 4-year-old, and I can't imagine, you were talking about how they can write better progress notes, and I'm like, I just can't imagine them writing a good progress note for a therapy session.
I hear that. And one of the things that I have happen a lot in the workshops that I teach where people ask questions about this, and sometimes it comes from a place of concern for the clinician, like, is AI ultimately going to take my job? What I tend to talk about then is if you work with kids, if you work with crisis, if you work with families with multiple people in the room, if you work with more severe levels of need, these are things that are a little bit safer from the encroachment of AI-based services, but that also means that AI is going to have a little bit of a harder time doing the documentation. I agree with you. I think that like with play therapy sessions, with couple and family-based therapy, it adds a layer of complexity that AI systems, again, are just going to take a little bit longer to be able to do.
Given that Wobot has done like many sessions of therapy, I'm wondering if any challenges to this have ever are there any significant legal cases that have come about as a result of AI and people challenging AI on some level. I don't know that there's something on the level of Terasoft, for example, but are there interesting legal precedents in the court systems related to this?
I think the short answer is not yet, but it's inevitable, right? With Wobot, Wiza, these other companies doing millions of sessions, at some point, one of the AI therapists is going to go off the rails a little bit
Right,
and say something that is interpreted as encouragement toward suicide.
right.
And the client's going to die by suicide, and there's going to be a lawsuit.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the reason why the AI companies right now are very, very cautious in their terms of service.
Yeah.
And when they have a consumer that is signing up for service with this system, they have a pretty ironclad waiver of liability that they try to put into place.
Right.
Now, Wobot is a little bit different in the sense that Wobot right now, in the process of trying to get registered as a medical device with the FDA, they are moving forward in a much more controlled and guardrailed manner. So it's a chatbot based service, but anytime a consumer on that service starts using words or phrases that suggest crisis, that suggest suicidality, that suggest there might be a need for reporting, their system automatically and immediately kicks that over to a human therapist
Oh,
who
wow.
essentially takes over, who takes responsibility for that care, can handle reporting responsibilities, can handle crisis issues, and that kind of thing. Where I see some greater questions is with those systems that don't do that, those
Yeah.
systems that are just kind of outside of the realm of regulation, where they don't even have the same reporting responsibilities, precisely because they are not selling their services as therapy. They're not being run by licensed therapists with the obligations that come from licensure. They also work pretty diligently to have these ironclad waivers, but there is going to be a case like Terasoft at some point with AI where the court system is going to have to parse out exactly how much responsibility does the AI company have for the well-being of consumers using its service. To my knowledge, we just haven't had that test case yet.
Interesting.
Any other questions or comments for Dr. Caldwell?
I so appreciate the work you're doing, Dr. Caldwell. It's per usual. It's just always excellent. I'm really grateful for this work.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you. I appreciate it. I appreciate the chance to come and present to you all this morning. And if I can be of help or assistance with this process going forward, please do not hesitate to reach out. I'm more than happy to help.
That's great. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your time, and it's an ongoing conversation for us, and it's important to just kind of hear and think about different aspects of AI, which is here in our lives already. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks.
Dave, does he have plans to meet with the other advisory committees or the board?
As of right now, we have not asked him to attend any of their meetings. I did talk with the chair of the Behavior Analyst Advisory Committee with meeting at 1 o'clock today, and they mentioned that they thought his presentation would be helpful to share. So I will try to essentially share the broadcast from right now at that meeting at 1 o'clock for the Behavior Analyst group. But I could reach out to him and see if he'd be happy to come to the board meeting if the board would like that. I'd be happy to do that.
I could definitely see that being good for us.
A lot of good information.
Yes, definitely. Well, thank you so much for that. Did he say we were going to get the slides, or we were able to? Okay.
Yes, he has not provided those to me yet, but once I receive those, I'll upload them to the website and I'll send them out to the members of the committee.
Thank you so much. Okay, we're going to move back into our normal agenda. The next item is review and approval of the previous meeting minutes. So as soon as there's an opportunity to look at that, I'll take a motion to approve if there aren't any changes or corrections?
They look good to me, so I'll approve. Motion to approve.
There's a second?
I'll second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed, same sign. Thank you very much. Dave, I'll hand it back over to you for your director's report.
Thank you, Mary. Usually during this time, I provide information to the advisory committee about BSRB operations, and I highlight any items from the past board meeting. There was a real special board meeting that took place just about a couple weeks ago. The board likes to hold an annual planning meeting, which is an all-day meeting where they talk about items for the legislative agenda, items that require in-depth discussion. And that did take place September 29th and 30th. And so I'll spend the majority of my time talking about some of the items from that meeting. But just to touch upon a real quick operations update, since January of 2021, we've been broadcasting the meetings of the board and the advisory committees to the BSRB YouTube channel. We've also had a few special meetings that we have uploaded to the channel after the fact. And so I'm happy to report between all the meetings, I think we have about 175 meetings we've broadcast now, and those have been viewed over 10,000 times. So just want to thank you all for the work that you're doing and let you know that members of the public, students, licensees, they are paying attention. They are finding the information that we are putting out there, and I think it's helpful. I think we've received positive feedback from individuals, but I want to transfer that to you as well, so you know that the time you're volunteering here is really valuable. And not just the recommendations that get forwarded to the board, but the individuals who are watching for the marriage and family therapy profession, knowing what items are being discussed, recommendations that are moving forward, it's really, really valuable. So thank you again for all the work that you do. In terms of a couple of those special meetings I mentioned, I did want to highlight those for BSRB operations. We're really trying to take another step forward this year in terms of outreach to different groups. When I started with the BSRB, it was November of 2020, and you may recall 2020 was a very unusual year, and we weren't able to do a lot of things in person. Now that we've advanced several years past that point, we're making more of an effort to provide information to students, either by remote meetings or going in person to those schools. We're also trying to hold different types of educational or informational forums for different groups too. So back in September 26th and 27th, we held a couple of special informational forums. One was for educators for the different programs around the state. We did this for the first time last year, and we had about 30 to 35 individuals attend. This year, we did it again, and we had about maybe 40 people who attended that from the different programs around the state. And we know that we likely missed some representatives from some of the schools. So next year, we're hoping to expand that number and reach even more schools. But we put together some information on updates for the BSRB, information about multi-state compacts, recent changes in law, and then we focused on this at this meeting on changes to the regulations. And so then we opened it up for Q&A and answered any questions that those individuals had. And then the following day, we had a special meeting that was an informational forum for employers of mental health professionals, and that was on September 27th. And last year we did this for the first time, and we had about 30 to 35 attendees. This year, at least for confirmations of attendance, we had about 60 individuals who plan to attend that meeting or did attend the meeting. So really positive response from that, and happy to continue to have good dialogue with different individuals around the state, help them understand the work the board is doing to modernize the requirements for licensure and to listen to any concerns and see if there's flexibilities in different ways while making sure that we are taking care of the board's first priority, which is protecting the public. And so those were both two special meetings I want to make you aware of, good responses. And then next year, we might explore some different formats to even increase the number of people that we can have those meetings for, maybe by doing a webinar type format. So I'll keep you updated on those. I'd mentioned the board's last meeting, and that was on September 29th and 30th. The board traditionally holds a one-day planning meeting, and then in the past few years has been a regular meeting of the board in September. What the board decided to do this year was on the Sunday evening to hold a 2-hour meeting that would take care of most of the regular board items, and then the following day to do a full day of meetings to talk about other items for discussion. And this is a meeting that is off-site from the board office. We moved this meeting around the state. I believe 4 years ago or 3 years ago, we weren't able to hold the meeting in person because of the pandemic, but the following year we held it in Kansas City, and then we held it in Wichita, and this year we held it in Lawrence, Kansas. And we did have some members of the public who attended the meeting, and we gave them the opportunity to provide some feedback to the board as well at that meeting. So, in terms of some items from those board meetings, I did want to make you aware that one of the topics for discussion was advisory committee member expectations. So we have an advisory committee policy. You all had the chance to review that. This short policy is just a little over a page, and most of it focuses on clarifying the role of the advisory committee to assist the board with recommendations, or if the board referred items to the advisory committee to discuss those and then provide input back to the board. There is also some language in the policy that talks about the criteria when there's openings on the advisory committee and some of those discussions. There's really not a lot of language in terms of expectations for other requirements for advisory committee membership, or what advisory committee members should expect in terms of their role while serving on that committee. And so the board had a conversation about, should there be some additional language added to the policy that clarifies things like what happens if an advisory committee member gets a disciplinary violation? Or what if, should there be a standard or an expectation in terms of how many absences advisory committee members should have? Should there be an expectation that members of the advisory committee should live in Kansas? Should there be a requirement that members of the advisory committee are licensees under the BSRB? So there were quite a few of these topics that were open for discussion. The board had some comments, and there weren't firm recommendations to come from that meeting, but we're going to draft up the board's thoughts on some of those issues, bring them back for the board to look at the November board meeting. And then if there are changes, we will bring those to you to make sure that you're all aware of any changes to the advisory committee language. There were also some appointments to some of the advisory committees. At that meeting, there were appointments to the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee, Behavior Analyst, and also the Licensed Psychology Advisory Committee. So I think each of the advisory committee has added new members in the past year, which is exciting to see. The process usually will open up in the spring if they are opening because of individuals coming off the advisory committee. So at that time, we'll go ahead and talk to the advisory committee about process to identify new members and go from there. There was also some conversation at the meeting in terms of the SIPAC commissioner for the state of Kansas. So Kansas is now a member of 3 multi-state compacts for the professions overseen by the BSRB. The very first one that we joined was SIPAC, and that is for licensed psychologists. And since we have joined that compact, the board had appointed me to serve as SIPAC commissioner for the state of Kansas. So I've attended those meetings, represented the state of Kansas, and done my part to be commissioner in that role. However, we have now joined 2 other compacts, professional counseling multi-state compact and the social work multi-state compact. And so the board recently appointed me to serve as the compact commissioner for the social work compact. And I will be meeting with that group to try to help them with their rules and putting everything together to try to help that compact become operational as soon as possible. But I'm shifting out of my role from SIPAC commissioner. And so I did talk to Richard Noble. He's the senior member of the licensed psychology profession on the board, and he has agreed to be the new commissioner for the SIPAC commission. And so the board appointed him to serve in that role. He is not able to attend the annual meeting for SIPAC in November. So essentially the board's instruction on that was to name Richard Noble as the new SIPAC commissioner following that annual meeting. So I will attend that meeting on behalf of Kansas, and then immediately after that'll transfer to Richard, and he will become the new SIPAC commissioner going forward. Additionally, speaking of the social work multi-state compact, I will be serving as the compact commissioner for that compact. There was also the option in the language for that compact to have a backup commissioner appointed. So if the commissioner is unavailable or can't attend a meeting, another member who's identified as the official backup can attend. And so the board appointed Andrea Perdomo Morales, who is the senior member of the social work profession on the board. And so she will be serving as the backup compact commissioner for social work in case that I'm unable to attend any of those meetings or serve in that role. The board also considered several recommendations that have been forwarded from the advisory committee. The first item that they considered had to do with the test for licensed psychologists and master's level psychologists called the EPPP. The organization that created the test and administers the test is the Association for State and Provincial Psychology Boards, ASPPB. They have used the EPPP as the test for psychology for many years now. Some states had in the past an oral examination that was also a requirement for licensure, but the oral examination had come under fire in some states because of the level of subjectivity. And so ASPPB had designed something called the EPPP2, which they describe as more of a test of skills versus the EPPP being a test of knowledge. And so they have made the EPPP2 in the past something that states could voluntarily choose to adopt as a requirement for licensure, but there was not a requirement that states would have to adopt it. However, in the last year, they came out with a recommendation, or actually a decision by the board of ASPPB, that as of January 1st, 2026, any states that wish to continue to use the EPPP will have to require those applicants to not only pass the EPPP, which they will relabel Part 1, but they will also have to pass the EPPP2, which will be relabeled as EPPP Part 2. So they will essentially be saying that those two tests will now be one test with two parts. And any states that wish to continue to use the EPPP in any part will have to require passage of both. There are some states that believe they will not be able to adopt this standard because they have a specific test in their law, and they don't believe they'll be able to essentially adopt a new test as a requirement for licensure. There are other concerns that states have had concerning the price to take two different tests or two tests that will be charged separately, and some of the other factors involved with this. And so representatives from the Psychology Board in Texas put forward a proposed bylaw amendment to ASPPB bylaws that will be coming forward at the end of this year at their annual meeting, which, if passed, would give the states the opportunity to make that choice for themselves, whether or not to include requirement of passing the EPPP2 as a requirement for licensure. And so there are a few states that have already expressed support for that, but the advisory committees, the LP advisory committee and the master's level, were asked should they recommend to the board to support that recommendation and that proposed bylaw amendment. And the board did consider that recommendation, and both committees did recommend the board support it, and the board did vote to support the Texas proposed bylaw amendment. So at the annual meeting for ASPPB, we will be speaking in favor of that proposed bylaw amendment, and hopeful that passes, which will allow states the opportunity to have a more robust discussion about whether or not to include passage of the EPPP rather than have to include it as a mandatory across the board requirement. Another recommendation that had been forwarded to the board was by the Behavior Analyst Advisory Committee, and this was a recommendation to pursue language in statute, so basically a bill before the legislature to add a new board member for the behavior analyst profession. There are currently 12 board members, and the statutes do specify which profession those board members will serve in, and then 4 public members. There is not a board member for the behavior analyst profession, and so this was a recommendation that was put forward by the board 2 years ago. The legislature did remove it from the bill. This year, that was a recommendation the advisory committee forwarded to the board again, and the board did vote to support it again. The board will be requesting legislation to add a behavior analyst to the board as a 13th board member. There was also a recommendation, or 2 recommendations, from the Social Work Advisory Committee. As I mentioned, that bill that passed last year, there was a large bill put forward. Most of the base of this bill was put forward by the board of the BSRB, requesting a lot of positive changes to the different requirements for licensure. There were some amendments that were made in committee to the requirements to become a clinically licensed social worker. Previously, the statutes did list requirement of passage of 5 different classes in diagnosis and treatment to become a clinically licensed social worker. One of the items that was amended in committee was striking the specific reference of 4 of those classes and only including the psychopathology 3-hour class. There was also within the language that talks about the 3,000 hours that need to be accrued to become a clinically licensed social worker. 1,500 hours had to be in diagnosis and treatment. And there was some adjustments to the language that said the 1,500 hours could include but be not limited to diagnosis and treatment, which does change the meaning of that. And so the Social Work Advisory Committee had concerns there would be individuals that that weren't sufficiently educated or trained in being able to diagnose and treat, who once licensed would be able to do that independently. And so they requested that the board seek to restore that to the requirements for licensure for clinical social workers, but also wanting to be receptive to some of the intention behind those changes. There may be individuals who wish to hold an independent level of license and practice independently, but they may not be able to diagnose and treat. And there are some states that have something called an advanced generalist license for social work. And so the second recommendation from the advisory committee for social work was to create that new level of license in Kansas as a specialist level of license, an advanced generalist. And so this would be an independent level license, but they would not be able to diagnose and treat independently. And so the board tabled the discussion and recommended that the social workers on the board and staff of the BSRB reach out to NASW Kansas, which we have done, to try to see if we could meet with them before the board's November board meeting to see if perhaps we can work together on some of these proposals and find some common ground to go forward to the legislature together. As of now, we have not been able to identify a date for that meeting before the November board meeting. We have received some possible dates after the November board meeting, but we're still trying to see if there's any room to meet before that meeting. If not, we will try to see if we can meet with representatives of NASW Kansas after the meeting and then see if we can take care of any common grounds that we can work together on for some of these proposals. The last recommendations from the advisory committees to the board had to do with the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee. And there is a item that was passed in the legislation last year that created the first student temporary license for addiction counseling. It's for individuals that it's intended to help become sort of a pathway to individuals seeking to become licensed. And it's the board's first student temporary license. They would have had to have already 60 hours from a college or university with an emphasis in addiction counseling or a related field. And then they're making progress towards their 4-year degree. The hope is this would allow them to be able to work with a specific employer. They'd have to have an agreement with their school and the employer, but they would be able to work while they're finishing their degree and then become licensed as an addiction counselor. And so there was some requested changes to open this up a little bit for individuals that maybe had received an undergraduate degree that was in a different field, but maybe are enrolled in a program that is an addiction-related program. And so the board did express support for that. We're drafting some language and we'll bring that back to the board for that change. And then there was also a recommendation from the advisory committee that is similar to an item on your agenda today. It has to do with the construction of act statute for addiction counseling. There is some language that is sort of a carve out for individuals to be able to provide services without being licensed. And, you know, of course, in general, we want everyone who provides services to be licensed, but there is some language that allows students or interns to be able to practice while they're in those categories. But there was also some language that said, or individuals preparing for the practice of addiction counseling. And that language is a bit vague and it does not have a definition in our statutes or regulations. And we want to make sure that we have clear standards in terms of who can practice and who cannot without having to have a license. We brought this to the advisory committee. They discussed it. Ultimately, they recommended striking that language as it is unclear and it does not, based on our review of the statutory history, it does not appear that was put in to help a specific group of individuals. And so they recommended striking that from the statute. And in your statute as well, there is language that talks about students or interns and also references or individuals preparing for the practice of marriage and family therapy. So we'll ask you to discuss that topic today a little bit later. But the board did recommend that or voted to recommend the addiction counseling recommendation to strike the language for the addiction counseling statute. In terms of some other items, on the following day, we provided some updated information on licensing for the BSRB. It is difficult to quantify some of the timeframes for licensure. And part of that is because under our current system, we have a model which uses several different mechanisms that are not all integrated and they don't work together in an efficient way all the time. We do the best that we can, but we use processes that we have kind of created and are making work together. But the board recently voted to move under a new licensing platform, ACELA, and that is the state enterprise licensing system. And so over the next 2 years, we'll be moving to that, and that will integrate a lot of our functionality that we're currently doing right now. but we did provide some examples to the board of the steps that individuals walk through on their path to become licensed. And we tried to show them some of the reasons why there might be more time, such as individuals maybe submitting things incomplete, or maybe not answering all the questions on a form, or someone has taken the licensing examination, but we only get 4 reports from some of those companies, once a month. And so we tried to kind of show them the real path to licensure for some of these applicants and how we are trying to address some of these things and some of them that we've already been able to address. And so we also tried to look at the licensing timeframes from a big picture perspective, understanding that some of these timeframes are outside of the board's control or the agency's control, but just looking at different groups of applicants from when the first document was received, their application, to when they were actually licensed. And we tried to compare fiscal years. And so looking at fiscal year 22 to 23 and to 23 to 24. And we're happy to report that the overall timeframes for licensure have decreased when looking between 22 and 23, and also have decreased between 23 and 24. And so we're trying to clean that up a little bit more to really kind of show really good examples of some of those timeframes. But from a big picture perspective, we are seeing some increase in efficiency. And I know part of that has to do with, for many years, the number of licensees under the board increased significantly, but the staffing did not. And we have been able to add a few new staff members over the last few years, and that has helped us quite a bit. I think we've reached the point now to where, at least in terms of licensing, we are operating as efficiently as we can with our current tools. But when we have the new licensing system, I think that will help us even more. So moving on to some other updates from that meeting, there was a topic of conversation that had to do with supervision and individuals seeking supervision, especially for professional counseling, marriage and family therapy. We are continuing to see sort of an issue here where some individuals are requesting exceptions to what the law currently allows in terms of, the advisory committees for professional counseling and marriage and family therapy have weighed in that in general, they would like the supervision to be provided by someone who is from those professions. And we have reached out to the Kansas Counseling Association, and they have weighed in as well, saying that they really strongly believe that the person providing counseling supervision to a counselor should be a professional counselor. But we also are hearing from employers who would like more flexibility and who can provide supervision. And so this is kind of a push and pull we brought to the board. The board asked the advisory committees for both professional counseling and marriage and family therapy to continue this discussion. And I do have kind of a possible, a proposal for you all to discuss when we get to that item on the agenda. But the board did take this item and say we'd like each of the advisory committees to continue to discuss this topic. We also talked about an expedited application review process. This is something that we have been trying to put together, but there's really not an example from another licensing agency in the state that has sort of a model for this. I've also asked my contacts in other states in terms of developing an expedited application review process, and they really don't have an example of this either. But we had a good conversation with the board. We tried to identify groups that we thought could benefit from something like this if we can identify the categories that someone would fit into. And so we're going to bring back a proposal to the board at the November board meeting. And if it looks good, we could potentially move forward with that in the regulations after that November board meeting. Additionally, there's a rule that's out for public comment in Texas that would allow additional remediation for the board in Texas if there are small deficiencies in the regulations for requirements for licensure. This does not supersede the requirements in the statute, but in Texas, if this goes into effect, it would allow their board the ability to look with increased flexibility to say, instead of denying someone outright for licensure, if there are small deficiencies, you could require some additional continuing education hours or additional coursework or additional hours of supervision or something like that as an alternative. So we brought this to the board. We'll try to adjust the language with legal counsel and see if that's something that could be helpful for the board to consider. There was also a proposal we brought to the board to have the ability for academic institutions to request clarification on whether their program meets the requirements for licensure, independent of an applicant for licensure. And what I mean by that is the way that our statutes and regulations are written, they're from the perspective of the applicant. When they apply for licensure, it says that they attend a program that met these following standards. And so we don't have any control over educational institutions to tell them how they should design a program. It's more of if someone attends a program that meets those characteristics, they meet the requirements for licensure. But we have had schools that have approached us as to say, you know, we would like the assurance from the board that our program does meet the requirements for licensure. The problem is there's no way for us to be accountable with our staff time because we can't accept a fee from any schools to use our staff time to do those types of reviews. Under this model, which I believe is being used in Missouri, we would be able to charge a small fee. And this is not a mandatory thing for any schools, but under this model, we would be able to accept a fee to be able to use our staff time to review the program and then give them an opinion whether their program meets the requirements for licensure or if there's any deficiencies we could outline for them. And we think there are some schools that would voluntarily choose to do this and for the assurance and that way they can hold it out for students as well. So we're going to be trying to write something up for the board to consider for that in November. Just to kind of highlight a couple other items. Currently right now for continuing education, the social work profession allows individuals to submit their programs for pre-approval from the board, but they're the only profession that has that. We thought this would be a good time now that we're moving under CE broker that we could open this up to allow other professions if they wish to have a course submitted for pre-approval for a fee, that they could be able to request that from the board. And then if they do meet the requirements, they could hold that out. It's not required for any CE providers, but it could be another way for the board to make revenue. And that way we could have some additional flexibility in terms of licensing fees for applicants. And then the last item I think I'll comment on here is we've had a discussion about fees for the BSRB. And back in 2019, the board aggressively lowered a lot of fees for applicants. I believe at that time, application fees and renewal fees were lowered by $50 each, which is a pretty significant decrease. We knew that that would not be sustainable forever, but it would be a way for the board's fee fund balance to go down over time. And that has occurred to some level. Our fee fund balance was as high as 2.1 million, and now it is down to 1.8 million. Our yearly expenditures are about 1.1 million. And so we think there is some room to have at least some temporary additional fee decreases. And so what the board voted on at that meeting was to put forward another fee decrease, and this would be to decrease original license fees by $50. And so this would be one of the first fees that individuals pay when they apply and are able to become licensed. And this would really help those individuals when they're starting out. And so really happy to see that. We'll put that through the regulations, but I'm happy to announce that that is something we think it'll decrease revenue by about $70,000, maybe $75,000 per year. And so we can sustain this at least probably for about 3 to 4 years based on other factors. But happy to announce that, and we'll be moving forward with that. So with that, I'll go ahead and end my report and see if there's any questions over anything I talked about in terms of operations or items from the last board meeting.
Sorry about that. I had to grab a quick phone call. So are there any questions or comments for Dave? You always give so much information. I know it can be a lot for people to absorb. Okay. Well, thank you for that. We're going to go into the next agenda item, which is old business, referencing one of the pieces that Dave was just talking about, which is moving into the ongoing discussion of supervision of MFTs. I had reported to the board in our board meeting that from the previous conversations we've had in this committee that it felt like we were pretty strongly centered in the fact that we believe that MFTs should continue to be supervised by MFTs. The conversation is continuing to come about because of influences around workforce and strategies among organizations and agencies and practitioners to obtain supervision in a way that may be more cost effective and efficient and could be provided by a broader range of supervisors. So we, at the board's direction, are bringing this back as a discussion point. If you recall, there's only 2 licensed professions that have the approved supervisor in their statute, which is LPCs and us. And that can be limiting at some points for people to receive and obtain the supervision that they need and the hours to work. So really just want to open up for conversation again. I would say, I think there will be, conversations among certain groups around the state that say they're interested in getting a change made on this. And so I'm saying that from a point of informing our discussion, if we think about being ahead of something versus having to react to something that may be proposed to the legislature this year. Again, I don't know that to be true. I'm just from other meetings that I've been in and hearing. And so wanted to bring back the discussion so we can really have some thoughtful pieces around it. I know Dave has a proposal for us to consider or to think about too, but I just want to pause there first and just get some initial reactions or thoughts about this conversation. And for the newer members, I can't remember time-wise when we had all of this discussion, so we've had it a couple of times, so feel free to chime in. Really centers around our MFTs, squarely thinking that we need to maintain supervision hours by MFTs at the postgraduate level.
And the issue is relative to also having an adequate workforce, correct? So am I fair to say I do try to with some regularity for reasons of what I'm doing here at Friends to get a list of who's currently improved supervisor. It seems to me that that list is growing with some, for a while, it was quite limiting. And I do wonder if there's any measure of advantage that supervision could be done online. So there is, I don't know if that helps with
It
workforce
can.
options that it could, I mean, theoretically, I know I too would have an ideal in terms of wanting to be in person, but could offer supervision really with anybody across the state. And I don't know if that's a useful thought.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for that.
I mean, I still feel pretty firm it should be MFTs with MFTs, because the other, like, you can get additional training let's say you're a social worker, you get additional training in couples therapy or family therapy, but that's not guaranteed. And I feel like it's just at the core of who we are that needs to be at the root of supervision.
Okay.
Agreed. Agreed. I do think there's a I mean, there's a great measure of overlap, but I think there's a very significant difference just in training and theoretical orientations related to the two different fields that I'm not trying to be siloed, but I think there's some professional identity pieces that are really important to maintain.
Yeah, and those particular words I know have come up in the LPC discussion of this very topic is that professional identity, and we orient ourselves in a different way around systems and how we, problem development, all the pieces of our theories that inform our work. I will say, not that I'm supporting, I'm just giving you some of the thoughts that I've heard, and part of the discussion is, getting a broader perspective in postgraduate world. Would it matter as long as it's good supervision? So in other words, someone who's had, 30 years of great clinical practice, does that make them a good supervisor? So also hearing in particular in agency settings where maybe there aren't MFTs available, then that becomes maybe a barrier, a limit to hiring. So those are just things I'm giving you as pieces I've heard. Dave, I don't know if you'd like to kind of jump in with some of the suggestions or things you've been talking about with other groups.
Sure. And I did want to mention Marcy Lechtenberg has entered the meeting, so she's
Yes, welcome, Marcy.
Yeah, so in terms of trying to find a middle ground, as Mary mentioned, I am hearing too that there may be individuals who are interested in pursuing legislative action in terms of opening things up. And you always try to extend offers to talk to people, and you hope that you can meet with them ahead of time. But what I've experienced the last few years is sometimes you really don't get that opportunity. Sometimes things just come up in a committee and you hear about it for the first time when a member is making the motion. And that's unfortunate. But that is reality sometimes. And so in an effort to be sort of proactive and at least offer maybe something in the middle of the two positions. I wanted to just bring to the committee a proposal. This is not something that I'm saying I'm recommending this and I encourage you to do this. It's just sort of an alternative, kind of a different way to think about it. Right now, the requirement in the statute is that there are board-approved supervisors. And in the regulation, it does talk about under extenuating circumstances, other individuals can be able to serve in that capacity. I do think that probably just the way the legislature is going with us having different things in the regulation and the statute and the scrutiny of the regulations in general, it's probably going to be helpful for us to move some of the language on extenuating circumstances or something like that to the statute, so we can have it all in the statute versus having part of that in the regulation. But in terms of the push and pull between having marriage and family therapists provide the supervision versus others, one solution could be to have some new language which would say applicants can have up to half the hours of supervision provided by someone who is not a marriage and family therapist, as long as they meet the other requirements, and then still hold to the requirement that half the hours need to be by someone who is a marriage and family therapist. And I did ask our staff members to kind of look at other states to see if there is a clear standard. The thing is there are states that kind of fall in different places on some of this. Some of the states require board-approved supervision. Some of the states do not. Some of the states do require that supervision is provided by marriage and family therapists. Some of them have more flexibilities in terms of other providers. So this is a scenario where you could potentially continue to require that at least some of those hours are provided by marriage and family therapists. But it would also kind of meet the other voice that's in this conversation asking for increased flexibility as well. So just kind of wanted to bring that in as a topic for discussion and see if you all had any thoughts about that.
So as I'm listening, would that be, I just want to make sure, is that suggestion for the exception that it would be half has to be MFT, or would that be anybody would have to have at least half of their supervision by an MFT?
So right now, the statute says, if I'm understanding your question right, it does say that people providing this level of supervision would have to be board-approved supervisors. So that is kind of a question. If you wanted to continue to hold the board-approved supervisor requirement, then it would go towards sort of the exception of who else can provide this level of supervision. So right now, the language says, in addition to being a board-approved supervisor, it would either be by people who are clinical marriage and family therapists or by individuals who hold a sufficient level license under the BSRB. So that is a question for the advisory committee. If you wanted to mandate that using the current language and bringing that over in a statute, if you wanted to say they would still need to be a board-approved supervisor, but half the hours could be by someone, and then this would change that extenuating circumstance language. So instead of calling for an extenuating circumstance for any of the supervision to be provided, it would allow basically half or up to half to be provided by someone from another profession, basically.
I mean, to me, that feels very confusing. I feel like they're going to get two different versions of supervision. And then which one am I supposed to listen to? Like the social work or counselor or whatever versus the MFT? Because I don't know. I've never done supervision out of MFT world. I just think it's probably very different. And that feels even more confusing than if someone just went with outside of MFT to begin with and did it all there.
So, sorry, go ahead.
I just was saying, I'm not sure that alleviates any of the problem. If finding and locating the MFT supervisor is truly the challenge, then we're saying, okay, well, now you only have to do this for half. You still have to find and locate and develop the relationship. So I guess I'm not seeing that it's that much of a benefit to outweigh the negative things that we've all discussed.
Something that that we have received questions on, or I have heard from employers and I don't do supervision, so I'm bringing this as a kind of like, this is the idea people have in their head, is why does it matter the profession if your focus is on diagnosing and clinical work? And I had always been taught by the board members that it focused on the supervisee, developing the supervisee, not necessarily, I mean, you work on cases, but it's not just the case you're looking at, you're working with the supervisee as well. So that is something that people have said.
But I also, going on, it's about diagnosing and clinical work. MFTs do clinical work very differently than psychologists do, than social workers do. And so, yeah, maybe we all diagnose similarly, but the way we do treatment is not similar.
It's a different case conceptualization from the get-go. And maybe I have a slightly, I don't know if it's different opinion. Because my graduate degree is in professional counseling, and I got it in a state where I would have probably pursued like an LPC license, but then moved to California where there was no counseling licensure, and instead got on a track to be a marriage and family therapist, and had to take quite a bit of additional coursework to be able to meet the requirements from a COAMP program. And so I know both sides of that coin from the LPC, more individualized perspective, and the MFT, and I feel pretty strongly that MFT should supervise MFTs. That said, I worked in a hospital where I only had one MFT and had a bunch of therapists that were LPCs, and part of me administratively was already supervising them, but I couldn't do the clinical supervision of them, which was a little frustrating. So I guess I'm a little bit of a hypocrite in that, because I felt like I should have been able to supervise the LPVs, but I do believe strongly the MFTs, because we conceptualize cases so differently, we approach dynamics so differently, that I feel pretty strongly that we should be supervising our own.
Betsy, I really appreciate what you're saying, because I also there's a part of me that feels pretty strongly for lots of reasons about MFTs, supervising MFTs, and I'm just trying to ask myself, is my siloed bias making it difficult for people in different parts of the state? Because I worked in a hospital right out of grad school too, and they couldn't figure out what I was as an MFT. They didn't know what to do with me.
Yeah.
Didn't fit into anything medical. And yet I really think I had a lot to contribute to what was going on. And so I really appreciate that, because I don't want to do things that are going to limit MFT opportunities in Kansas. And yet I do feel pretty strongly about maintaining MFTs as supervisors. And I'd like to ask another question if I could. Am I understanding? I just want to make sure, David, I heard you correctly. So LPCs or MFTs and LPCs are the only ones that are required to have an approved supervisor. Is that correct?
They're the only two professions that have the board approved supervisor process.
Yeah, yes. So social workers do not. No other.
No. And I will tell you that the social workers did make an attempt in previous legislative years to get that into statute, and it was declined. It was stricken from a proposal. So there was a move made, but in light of workforce challenges, I don't believe that the legislature was supportive of anything that added barrier to workforce.
So
it was vocally fought against by NASW Kansas as well. So the association was opposed to board approved supervisors for social work.
Stunning. So then is my thinking correct? I really need to make sure you're telling me I'm using my head right here. So if another profession could do supervision, then a person that could do that could potentially be a social worker who, by the way, is not required to have any training in supervision itself. So the standard for supervision really has gone up for professional counseling, and for MFT, not for social work, but social work by that opportunity could then potentially be a supervisor. Is my thinking right about that?
Well, let me read from the regulation, because that's a very good question. There is a regulation, is KAR 102-5-7A. It's the professional postgraduate supervised experience requirement for a clinical marriage and family therapist. And if I could direct your attention to, it's in your packet of material. It's item C, and I'll go ahead and share my screen so we can all kind of look at the language of this. But I think it could be helpful to kind of see what it currently says. So this is again the regulation that I referenced in Part C. It says the clinical supervisor of a person attaining the 3,000 hours of postgraduate supervised professional experience required for licensure as a clinical marriage and family therapist at the time of providing supervision shall be a board-approved clinical supervisor and shall meet one of the following provisions. So they have to be a board-approved supervisor, and they have to meet one of the following two. They have to either be a clinical supervisor, shall be a clinical marriage and family therapist who's licensed in Kansas or is registered, certified, or licensed in another jurisdiction, and who is engaged in the independent practice of clinical marriage and family therapy, including the diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders, for at least 2 years beyond the supervisor's registration, certification, or licensure date as a clinical marriage and family therapist. Or looking at C again, they would have to be a board-approved clinical supervisor, and number 2, under extenuating circumstances approved by the board, the clinical supervisor may be a person who is registered, certified, or licensed at the graduate level to practice in one of the behavioral sciences and whose authorized scope of practice permits the diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders. The qualifying individual shall not have had less than 2 years of professional experience in the independent practice of clinical marriage and family therapy beyond the date of the supervisor's registration, certification, or licensure. So this is what it currently states. Prior to opening up supervision that it could be done all by televideo, the previous standard, instead of extenuating circumstances, had been looking at availability, and that was more of a looking at how close in proximity someone was than we had generally talked about within a certain number of miles. But with it being opened up to televideo, that changed to the new standard under extenuating circumstances. You could have an exception, and so that would be the C2 scenario. So hopefully the answer is part of your question.
And further in the regulation, it says that the supervisor has to have knowledge and experience with the client population and have knowledge and experience with the methods of practice that the supervisee employs.
And so you're talking about section D here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So technically, it sounds like they would have to have training or experience in systems, right? I mean, is that what it?
I suppose 5 gets at that somewhat.
Yeah, I'll share 2 other circumstances or specific things that I've heard in this discussion with. One of them is, what if I am an MFT who has a specialty area that I want to practice that is in, I can't find an MFT supervisor for that. So, some eating disorder, any specific topic that maybe they wanted to be specialization in that they couldn't find an MFT supervisor. So that's one other thing I've heard. The other piece that comes up probably the most loudly in conversations is the opportunity for an MFT to receive their supervision at a work site free of charge to them. But if there's not an ability to have an MFT on site, then they don't get the benefit of that free opportunity to continue supervision and do their postgraduate work as a, if you will, lack of a better term, an employee benefit, right, from that group, which is on the other hand, as Betsy and Chris have just mentioned, I mean, when you have an agency framework, you are looking at how can I recruit and retain people and what are those benefits I can offer. So I have heard it in that subset too. So just giving you information.
One other thought I've had, just as we're sitting here talking about it, and it doesn't necessarily pertain to just Kansas, but if, as David suggested, there's like a certain number of hours that you get from an MFT. And maybe I'm thinking of it because right now I'm on the tail end of my AMFT approved supervisor designation. How is that professional organization? Because I mean, I can guarantee the AMFT is going to want to keep the MFTs, supervising MFTs. And how is that going to play out? Just a thought. I don't know, Chris might have a thought on that. Maybe.
How's that going to play out? I mean,
Well,
yeah,
if there was like, yeah, if there was something like David suggested where you're only getting half or a certain number of your hours from an MFT down the line.
I guess I agree with you. I'm just, it sounds like you're asking me something. I'm not sure.
No, I just wondered if you had a thought on that. I don't have a specific question. Just I was saying you're thinking about what ramifications there might be towards only having a certain portion of your hours supervised by an MFT. And I said, like, just because I'm kind of in the tail end of all the hoops right now. And I, not that we're talking Kansas, but I know that has definite ramifications on the Missouri side, the way that they do their paperwork and everything from having done that as well. So since I'm so close to the state line, that automatically pops in my noggin too.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think, oh, go ahead,
Missouri's a lot
please.
more free in terms of who can be a supervisor.
True.
Something that I would, when you're talking about that, so it's more recent that we put in extenuating circumstances. It used to be unavailable. And so it was more open to allowing other supervisors. And I mean, it did that. I don't think that had an effect on the AAMFT credential. But also, when Mary was talking about the different things we hear, so if we allow all our supervision online, many states do not. So if someone completes their hours here under an MFT online, they may not be able to move to another state and get a clinical level license without doing their hours over again. Because a lot of reciprocity is based on what you completed being equivalent to what they require. And that people further out in the state of Kansas to the west don't have their internet is not that great, and that online supervision is not always an option.
What about the option of, instead of saying that anybody can supervise an MFT, what if we took away, I don't even know why this is in place, so I'm sure there's an explanation, but it doesn't have to be board approved. It could just be someone who's maintained an LCMFT for 2 years or something like that.
Yeah, well, certainly that would, that would require the statutory change as well. And it would, that work came from this committee too, to create the designation and the training and the requirements. So I think it's a matter of, was that intention of doing that? I am familiar with that. The intention was exactly what we're talking about, is to raise the quality of supervision and have some floor for what it takes to be able to supervise MFTs. So I mean, certainly an option to have. I don't know that it eliminates the other issues entirely, but certainly within a consideration.
I mean, it just, yeah, I don't feel great about that either, but if we have to lower the standards, would that be a better way to lower the standards than just letting anybody supervise an MFT?
Yeah, and I'll certainly reiterate a couple things. We don't have to make a recommendation to lower any standard. You know, these are talking points that are coming up that I want us to have had the dialogue and discussion on. So that's most important. And I really believe this dialogue has reinforced what I recommended from this committee before, that we're all really feeling strongly that this is something that's important to our profession, and that through professional identity, how we treat and practice. So I think for us, it's like, can we have some thinking around it? Because if what we may be aware of happens and there's a legislative ask to remove this, are we prepared for that inevitability as well? And are there opportunities for us to have other discussions or negotiations with groups ahead of that to make that more accessible? So I do want to point out, we don't have to do anything. And I believe, Dave, correct me, I think professional counseling decided that they still felt strongly that the LPC should supervise LPCs. Do I have that correct?
Yes, they had a similar discussion. They did make a recommendation to go with that proposal that I had referenced in terms of doing half of the hours, but it was very split. It was definitely not a uniform recommendation, and I heard from people afterwards who, told me that if they could go back and change their decision, that they would. So I don't think it was a very strong, support for making that recommendation. It was just, I think, in terms of some of the comments that were made, there were concerns that if a legislative change is made where they would lose any kind of requirement that professional counselors would have to provide the supervision, that would be really harmful. And so it was sort of concern about losing that potentially, because they are valuing a lot of the same things that you're talking about in terms of supervision by the profession. So that was forwarded to the board, but I can't say what the board will move forward with that. And I will definitely communicate kind of what I'm communicating to you at the board meeting, that this was not a uniform recommendation. There was still a lot of consternation and thoughts on both sides of it, for sure. But what I would ask, if you don't have a recommendation today, and
Yeah.
given the feelings that you have vocalized, I can tell you it is incredibly helpful to have additional voices at some of the bill hearings. Sometimes, when those hearings take place, I go to the microphone and I try to cover a lot of topics, and sometimes I'm limited to only a few minutes. But when there are other voices that are bringing forward thoughts and values, that is really helpful for members of legislative committees, because frequently what happens is the opponents for something like this will mobilize and bring some people to the microphone. And if that's the only voices they hear from, they may get the impression that those are the only positions counter to what the board currently has in place. And from what you're talking about, it doesn't sound like that's true, but I think if you feel strongly about these things and you don't want to make a recommendation for a change today, I would encourage you to come to those hearings and really speak to some of these topics.
Thank you for that, Dave. We will have another advisory committee before the end of the year. Certainly, between now and then, if you have other thoughts or other opinions or things you'd like us to consider, please bring those forward, because I think it's important that we have time to think about these things differently and feel like we have a good recommendation. So I'm hearing we'll make no recommendation today. It sounds right now we're sort of at the same place that we were, which is fine. And I think we'll have a board meeting between this and the next advisory committee. Just trying to think of the timing of things. Okay.
I believe it's November 4th. It's the first Monday in November.
There's a part of me that's just almost wanting a data point, but I'm not sure what I want to ask for. I think the thing I just want to make sure is I'm not trying to advocate in a way that makes it hard to be an MFT in places where we want MFTs to be able to practice. And I'm really trying to temper this desire I have for us to maintain this identity, along with making it Kansas as viable as possible for MFTs to practice in a multitude of settings and in a multitude of places. So I know, so I wonder how often maybe the regulatory board gets requests for, or gets contacted about, I have an extenuating circumstance. Is this happening infrequently, or are your phones ringing off the hook with that kind of request? And I don't know if that's even a fair thing to ask.
It's a fair question. I can say, honestly, it does not come up with MFTs as often as it does for LPCs. We have a lot of requests for extenuating circumstances for professional counselors and not that many for MFTs.
But it's also kind of difficult to answer that question too, just because if there are employers that have been told this is the standard, they're not likely to bring those requests back to the board because they're matching the standard that's in place. And so if it was a different one and we had more flexibility on this, they might be bringing more of them to us to see if they could get through. So.
And there are more counselors than MFTs, I believe. So that plays into it as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, well, great discussion. I really appreciate everyone's input in that as we're thinking through these things that keep coming up. So very much appreciate your time and your comments to that. Dave, I think we wanted to make sure that we hit, trying to remember if you wanted the new business A that we hit, because that was more time sensitive.
Yeah, we
Yes.
can go ahead and table the other.
If you don't mind, we'll kind of rework the agenda just to hit what's important for this meeting.
Absolutely. And it does say that on the agenda that we can take items out of order as needed. So, but just one note about the survey, we are still planning to send out the survey to licensees, and I think we'll try to send that out between the date and the next meeting. So hopefully we'll have some additional data for you as far as that goes too. But under new business, there is an item here that I prepped for you during my report. It's a copy of KSA 65-6409, the Construction of Act statute for marriage and family therapy, and I'll share my screen here. This is the topic I talked about for the addiction counseling profession, and I believe their statutes were likely modeled after the marriage and family therapy statutes when that profession became licensed. But this 65-6409 Construction of Act, it says nothing in the Marriage and Family Therapist Licensure Act shall be construed to prevent marriage and family therapy practice by students or interns or individuals preparing for the practice of marriage and family therapy to practice under qualified supervision of a professional recognized and approved by the board in the educational institution or agency, so long as they are designated by titles such as student, trainee, intern, or other titles clearly indicating training status. And I think one of the issues that we have seen at least a couple times has been individuals providing services that would normally call for there to be a license. And what we have talked to with the employer is that they have claimed these were individuals preparing for the practice. And we don't have a clear definition of that term in the statutes or regulation. Based on just looking at the legislative history, to my knowledge, in terms of the information that I've been able to find, I can't see that this was carved out for any specific group of individuals. And it seems more like this statute is really talking more towards students or interns versus this vague language or individuals preparing for the practice of. So the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee did discuss this. They weighed whether or not to add a definition for this group or to strike that reference from the statute. And ultimately, they recommended to the board just striking that language from the statute. And since your statute also has similar language, the board asked if this could be referred to the advisory committee for discussion as well. So I wanted to turn it over to you to open it up for discussion. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. I'll stop there and see if there's any discussion or questions on this item.
It seems like a really good thing to me.
We don't like there to be a lot of confusion or ambiguity in terms of which individuals can practice without a license or not. We definitely understand why the language for students or interns is in there, but this might be a nice statutory cleanup that would make our standards a bit more clear.
So I guess this scenario really to look on the counter is, in what scenario would you have someone who's not a student or an intern preparing for the practice of marriage and family therapy?
And Leslie, can you just kind of share what you have seen concerning this topic?
So I have not seen, actually, it hasn't come up with MFT. I didn't even know it was there until we started looking. It has come up more with addiction counseling and so if someone was doing their internship somewhere and then they're gonna hire them, it would allow them to practice before they're licensed, even before they have submitted an application to be licensed.
Or at least that's what they would assert.
Yes, yes, exactly.
We don't have a clear definition.
Right.
Of license. So
this is just what I've seen.
So that's really helpful because it's like the internship and the student is a status that has a clear ending. So the gap would be where right now our people who end internship and student level, they've graduated, there is this period of time in which they either need to apply for a temp license or decide not to work until they are applying for their regular license. Because of this language, that is a loophole that someone could use to say, I'm able to practice because I'm still preparing for the practice of marriage and family therapy. So while it hasn't occurred to us in our profession, it hasn't happened, it certainly would open up an area that could be problematic. If that makes sense to everybody.
And this solves that.
If we remove that language, it would solve that problem because internship and students are a status that end, right? Yeah.
I think I'm in support of striking it.
Any more discussion? Okay, there's a recommendation to strike that. Are we all in favor of that?
Yes. Aye.
Okay, anyone who disagrees with that?
As
Okay.
a public
Oh,
member,
go ahead, Jim.
I'll just abstain. I think this is an issue that I like to listen to the professionals talk, so I'm going to abstain from that.
Okay, thank you, Jim. We'll note that. Okay, thank you, Dave. We'll move forward with that recommendation. Okay, so I'll kind of you mentioned the survey already. Do you think we can tackle the discussion of professional description on the website in the next 5 minutes?
I don't think so.
Let's go into the meeting dates and schedule then, perhaps as an easier agenda item. Wonderful. Okay, so one of the things we were talking about is meeting dates for 2025. We have been generally meeting on the second Friday of each every other month from this time frame. If that regularity still works with everyone, we would go ahead and Dave would move forward in putting calendar holds for 2025 on your schedule, recognizing sometimes there's a one of those meetings we have to renegotiate depending on things going on. But is everyone comfortable with this time frame? And we have new members too, so. Okay. Excellent. That sounds like we will get that prepared. Would like to open it up if right now you have any thoughts of additional topics that we can be looking forward to for the as we build the 2025 agendas. Anything on your mind that we can bring? And if not now, I would offer, just like this presentation for AI came up, I think these are really good opportunities for us. So if there are things you come across in other settings that you think the advisory committee could benefit from hearing, please let Dave or I know, and we'll make sure to get them on our advisory committee agendas. Okay, feel free to send those if you think of things or if you come across someone, we'll accommodate those. We have then, our next meeting is scheduled for December 13th at 10 a.m. And I think you already have that placeholder on your calendar for that. We will bring back then the old business that we did not address today, which is continued discussion of the AI, and then also talking about the descriptions of professions on the practice. And is there anything else for today? Okay, well, thank you all so much for your comments and your involvement and engagement. We appreciate that so much to have such rich dialogue. Heidi, were you going to say something?
I was just getting ready to motion to adjourn.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you, Heidi. Okay, next thing out of my mouth. Thank you all so much. We'll take a motion to adjourn.
I support that.
All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Thank you all so much. Meeting's adjourned.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Good one.
Bye.